Translation Theory 2. Concept of System. With his papers in Historical Poetics 1978, Ibn Zohar brought about a sea change in the way literary translation was perceived and researched. His polysystem theory laid the much needed groundwork for the future theorists like Gideon Toury, André Lefebvre and the Theo Hermans to build upon. His model freed the translation theory from the blinkers of the source text and shifted the agency for decision making in favor of the target language and culture. He borrowed the notion of system from Russian formalist Juruji Tianzhao, who used it to denote a multi-layered structure of elements which relate to and interact with each other. Baker P. 176. Tianzhao viewed individual work of literature, literary genres, literary traditions, and even entire social order as forming individual and distinctive systems in their own right. The different systems interact with each other in a matrix of unequal power relations and bring about evolution of literature and literary traditions. What is polysystem? Ibn Zohar uses the terms system and polysystem interchangeably, but a finer distinction between the two can be made insofar as polysystem was conceived as a dynamic concept in contradistinction with static connotations the term system acquired in Saussure's linguistics. To him, polysystem is a heterogeneous, hierarchized conglomerate of systems which interact to bring about a dynamic process of evolution within the polysystem as a whole. Secondly, he believed that the various strata and subdivision within a particular polysystem vie with each other for a dominant position. Thus, in the case of literary polysystem, there is a constant friction between the center and periphery in which different literary genres, that is, those literary norms and works which are accepted as legitimate and cherishable by dominant circles, that is, masterpieces, compete. It also includes low genres like children's literature, popular fiction, and translations which traditionally didn't fall within the domain of literary studies. Though these low forms remain on periphery, they can either provide stimulus to the canonized forms or else militate against them to introduce innovative and subversive literary elements in the mainstream of literature. Thus, the allegedly low genres play a decisive role as the agents of literary evolution. Zohar also maintains that the position of power at the center keeps shuttling between what he calls the primary and the secondary on periodic basis. What replaces the orthodox mainstream as innovative and avant-garde becomes reactionary in due course of time and struggles to sustain its position at the center by resisting the newer gang of the subversive. Standing of translation in literary polysystem. Zohar makes a call to discern a specific pattern and relation amongst all seemingly isolated and random translations available in a literary polysystem. He avers that majority of this corpus of translations would be texts that directly or indirectly corroborate or espouse the dominant poetics of their times. This is so because a low genre like translation would not be allowed within a system to fall too far out of step with what is considered acceptable and literary in a particular polysystem. However, he warns that this secondary or inferior position is not a perennial law and has to allow for exception. The exception being a situation which translated literature occupies more and more central position in literary system. The subsystem of translation occupies central position when the young literature is in the process of being established and translation provides ready-made models from older literatures. The original literature of the system is weak, that is, literature of small nations is overshadowed by that of a larger nation. The older established models cease to be tenable and the void left by them is filled by the influx of fresh ideas through translations. Thus, translations can either conform to already existing models or else introduce original elements into system. But the point is that the ways in which translation is practiced in a given culture are themselves dictated by the position which translated literature occupies in literary polysystem and by the models, literary and translation, which are currently operative in the target literary system. To quote Ibn Zohar, translation is no longer a phenomenon whose nature and borders are given once and for all, but an activity dependent on the relations within a certain cultural system. 1990:51. Polysystem, rather than being a foolproof waterlight theory, has served a point of departure for scholars like Lefebvre, notions of patronage, and Toury, notions of translation norms, and Hemang's notion of translation as the manipulation of literature to carry it further in a more systematic and pragmatic manner. Gideon Toury's Descriptive Translation Studies, DTS. In Search of a Theory of Translation, 1980, a collection of Gideon Toury's papers articulate his trail-blazing theory called Descriptive Translation Studies. Instead of providing guidelines for the next translation to be made and passing judgment on the number of the existing ones, Toury takes the translated text as it is and tries to determine various factors that may account for its particular nature. Descriptive translation studies foregrounds an explicit refusal to make a priori statements about what translation is or what kind of relationship a TT should have with ST. In descriptive translation studies, there is an insistence on examining all translation-related issues historically in terms of the conditions which operate in the receiving culture. Furthermore, there is an interest in extending the context of research beyond the examination of translated text, in particular to include examination of evaluative writing on translation, prefaces, reviews, reflective essays, etc. Rather than attempting to evaluate translations, the focus here is on investigating the evaluative yardstick that is used in making statements about translations in a given socio-cultural context. In the translator's invisibility, Venuti surveys such evaluative writings or translations, such evaluative writings on translation in North American and European context and concludes that they are obsessed with the norms of transparency and fluency. He illustrates his point by citing terms like translationese, which carry deprecatory connotations to play down the status of count-normative translated text. He concludes that such criticism is of translation practice in the West marks of hegemony and ethnocentrism. Toury gives us an avant-garde concept of norms that refer to the regularities of the translation behavior in a given socio-cultural context. Norms can be identified by studying a corpus of authentic translations and critical commentaries on them to deduce regular patterns of translation, including types of strategies that are typically deployed by the translators represented in that corpus. The notion of norms assumes that the translator is essentially engaged in a decision-making process. Toury suggests that translator plays a social role and his acceptance of norms is conducive to his identity as a translator in a particular literary community. Norms to him are of three types. Initial norms involve basic choice between adhering to the norms realized in ST and culture of TL and culture. Preliminary norms refer to choice of genre, individual text, authors, etc. Operational norms refer to decision made during actual act of translation, that is the distribution of textual material, segmentation, omission, etc.